Good evening and welcome. Tonight's webinar, Lessons and Insights for Rural and Small Church Ministries. Our webinar tonight is brought to you by Union Presbyterian Seminary's Leadership Institute. I will serve as your host this evening. I am the director of the Leadership Institute, Chris Burton. Tonight, we will hear from our panelists, Reverend Katie Cashwell, Reverend Dr. Leonard Edlow, and David McDowell. Reverend Dr. Leonard Edlow is the pastor of New Hope Fellowship in Hartfield, Virginia, and former CEO of Edlow's Professional Pharmacies in Richmond. He is an educator, having served on the clinical faculty of 4 colleges of pharmacy, the executive in residence at the Longwood University School of Business and Economics. He is an adjunct professor of Christian ethics at the John Leland Theological Center and clinical professor of pharmacy at the Virginia Commonwealth University School of Pharmacy. Reverend Katie Cashwell is a graduate of Davidson College and Union Presbyterian Seminary. Katie has served churches in Annapolis, Maryland, and Washington, D.C., and spent several years directing conferences at Montreat Conference Center. She currently serves as Associate Presbyter of Small Churches for the Presbytery of New Hope. In that role, she resources and builds networks among small churches, provides opportunities for small church leadership development and ruling elder training, guides churches through transition, and reminds the good people of Eastern and Central North Carolina that Jesus was born in a small town. Amen to that. And lastly, we have David McDowell, a graduate of the University of Mississippi. David has spent a decade and a half working in local elections and legislative advocacy in Mississippi and across the South. During his attempts to shake off his call to Christian ministry, David represented organizations like the Mississippi Coalition Against Domestic Violence and Mississippi Votes in advocacy efforts to seek common ground in policymaking. Over the years, he has been encouraged to attend law school and always skirted the notion until he realized there was another type of law worth studying further. So now David finds himself seeking master's degrees of divinity and public theology in a dual program designed to recognize and prioritize the role of social justice from a 21st century Christian perspective. He is especially interested in growing the Presbyterian Church USA, faith in action, and exploring hope in the good news. Good evening and welcome to you all. Thank you all so much for being here this evening.
Good evening.
Let's start off this evening with what drew you to ministry in a rural setting. Dr. Edlow, would you care to start us off with this question? What drew you into ministry, particularly in a rural setting?
Well, it was very strange because I started off in the Methodist tradition and then went to the Baptist tradition. And one of my patients got ill and asked me to fill the pulpit for him. It wasn't a rural church. It was a sort of suburban church. And after I did that, he told me to preach all the time. And so at Virginia Union, they get your name out. And I had tried to run away from people and bought a house in Matthews County and ran into God. And then when one of my business partners saw my name at his Richmond church, he quickly connected me to one of his employees who was a member of the church in Matthews. So it wasn't intentional at all. It just happened. But for me, it was probably what I needed because I never intended to be a pastor. I was real content being associate minister in a mega church, just running the ministries. And I didn't really want to have a church in the city because I was already serving in the city. So it would have been it would have been more of a challenge trying to practice pharmacy and deal with ministry needs and people just being able to walk in any time of the day and expect you to stop as people do so many times.
Absolutely, absolutely. Reverend Castro, how about you? What brought you into this context of rural ministry?
Thank you, Chris. Well, I should begin by saying that I am serving at the mid-council leadership level. So I'm not currently serving a rural church. And I have served churches in D.C. And in Annapolis, and then lived in the small town of Black Mountain and was serving Montreat for quite a while. So I should also, in some truth telling, say that I grew up in a church of about 4,000 members. And so, what am I doing in rural ministry now and serving rural congregations? Well, my best answer to that is that Jesus said in the Gospels 22 different times, "Follow me." And so Jesus invited me on this journey to consider how it is I might be of service to our small churches. And I fundamentally believe I have a lot to learn, which is part of my calling to serve the rural churches and our presbytery. We have about 60% of our congregations have less than 100 members. And when I was considering taking this position, that number really stuck out to me. It's a reflection of, it's really captures the reality of the landscape of our churches, that we really are a small church presbytery. We're increasingly a small church denomination. And I think I have a lot to learn in that regard. And I think shifting from my understanding of what it means to be church and to understand it more in smaller contexts and in rural contexts. So yeah, I have followed Jesus all over central and eastern North Carolina in this position, and I continue to learn something every time I hit the road, and every time I'm with one of our churches. So yeah, I'm really excited for this conversation tonight, and to learn alongside all of you and the ministries that you're doing.
Thank you for that. How about you, Mr. McDowell? Would you like to share about how did you get involved with rural ministry?
I grew up not in rural Louisiana, but in suburban Louisiana, where as a Presbyterian, still very often felt like I was in exile. Just not that many of us. So in my one PCUSA church town, we were small and only sometimes mighty. But I think probably one of my first memories of like why we really needed to be there was when the Presbyterian mission showed up after Hurricane Katrina. And suddenly the space that we had that served, just a couple dozen people on Sundays and throughout the week in different ways, we still had a kitchen and a gym. And suddenly it became kind of a major epicenter and triage point for service to other people. And what it really represented to me early on through the church, and to be honest, I didn't always see it, was a sense of vitality. That in that moment, we were there in a unique place to serve, and it was very, very special. And growing out of that, that kind of just became part of my general call, and I wouldn't even say that it had morphed into Christian ministry at that point. But especially as I went off to college and moved to Mississippi, what I discovered was that social justice issues, especially in the Deep South, sure, things were happening in Jackson. Stuff was happening at Jackson State, but people were coming from all over rural America. I mean, from all over America to come to rural spaces to be places like with Fannie Lou Hamer and the work that Medgar Evers did was moving out into the fields, and those sorts of things. I mean, if that's not ministry, I don't know what is. Feeding people, educating people, register and vote, all of those things so directly tied in with the church. And they were quite often doing the same mission parallel to one another and then crisscrossing back and forth. And those things happened in rural Mississippi because that's where it was needed. And it just continued to push me into this understanding of vitality. And what I see now in seminary now and in this times that I go out and serve churches is that there are people who want to be fed and who are excited to hear the word and excited to be a part of community. and they're a little bit they're a little bit worn out of being described, I think, small, because in their reality they aren't. And because of that, it just feels to me, I just feel a deep call to make connection with those people, and and recognize what it means to be heard and seen and felt.
Certainly, certainly. Thank you for that. I want to share with you that it feels, from my lens, that small church ministry has a potential to be very countercultural. And the small church ministry, when you couch it within in the context of an empire culture, it's essential. And thinking about part of its essential nature is that we're in a general culture that over relies on, like, maximalist and the bigger the better, and things of that nature. So with all that being said, I want to have Reverend Castro start with this question. How do you understand success in a smaller context? Especially, you have the pleasure of serving from a Presbyterian level, so you're really able to sort of see it from a few 100 feet up, at least. Like, what does success look like in this smaller context?
Sure, I think that's a great question. Well, one thing I often ask myself is, how did Jesus define success in a smaller context within an empire? Because that was what he was doing in the context in which he was serving. One thing I always want to be sure to tell our small churches when I visit, when I preach, is that we are a small church presbytery. We are a small church denomination. That they are not odd birds in the fact that they are small.
Right.
And I think David sort of addressed that when he said, they don't consider themselves small because in their context, they're not small. And I think we sort of have to reframe our understanding of what the size of a congregation is, because I think often small churches can feel like they're not being successful, that they are dwindling in numbers, and that numbers are the only measure of success. But I have to help them understand that we are a small church presbytery. We have to act like it, and we have to support our churches so that they know that they aren't the exception. They are the church.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the ways that I'm trying to sort of help them see that success is that it's not in the numbers, but in what does their ministry look like, and in their particular context, are they serving their neighbor? Are they being the church in the world? In 2020, our New Hope Presbytery became a Matthew 25 Presbytery.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have joined that movement in the PCUSA. And the three sort of foci for Matthew 25 are eradicating systemic poverty, dismantling structural racism, and building congregational vitality. And Matthew 25 really invites churches of all shapes and sizes to that work in whatever their ministry context is. And I think particularly for small churches, Matthew 25 can help give them sort of a framework for success. Are we doing these three things? Because indeed, poverty, racism, and the need for vitality is very much present in rural communities and in small communities. And there's not just one way to be a Matthew 25 presbytery or church, I should say. So I think really it's about ordinary acts of compassion in daily life, which small churches excel at. And in fact, they often are being Matthew 25 congregations without even realizing it. That Jesus called us to love God and love neighbor. And that's sort of what it boils down to. And many of our small churches, they are doing that. They're deeply rooted in the communities that they're in. So I think sometimes the Matthew 25 movement, I think, just helps give them some scriptural context for the work they're already doing, and helps ground them in scripture of what it is they're doing and why they're doing it. So yeah, I think success can really look like being deeply embedded in the community, and serving their particular context that they're in. Going to some away games, right, and not just staying in their building. So yeah, that's sort of how I try to help them understand success.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Reverend Nidla, I'm curious to hear from your vantage point about the challenges that small and rural churches face, particularly in 2023 and on the cusp of 2024, as we think about this contemporary climate. What are those challenges that you've seen from your vantage point?
Well, the major problem is the aging of the church. So, in other words, I think my church in particular, when we started, we were 30% under 18 years old, but they grew up and they haven't come back in numbers. A few have come back and they have their children. So you've got that aging problem. And then now for me, we were able to pivot with COVID very quickly. And now I'm trying to adjust to the new normal, and I think a whole lot of other people are. And in doing this hybrid type worship, Bible study, church school. Now, the Bible study, church school has really gotten better because it's more convenient. But I worry about the fellowship thing because hybrid is there, and it's so much easier. Even though we've engaged people who never knew us, people who lived in the area. It's real funny when people say you're gonna have homecoming. I say, well, it's nobody come back home yet. We just started, but now people have gotten promotions and gone elsewhere,
Yeah.
and they've come back. But those are there, and then I think it's a governance issue. When you mentioned the question about empire, even though the churches are small, we have this tendency to uh, imitate or emulate the society. And so you get these fiefdoms and people holding on to power and not wanting to give up on power. And so that's really getting that governance changed. And at the same time, when you have this empire thing, trying to get people who for years have been told to wait, or you can't do this, or you can't do that, get them involved in ministry and feel empowered that they can do things.
Thank you for that. Thank you. Anyone else want to jump in with regard to the challenges that you've seen with regard to small or rural churches?
I'll just say something really quick as you a friend, Ben Robertson, Reverend Ben Robertson, who's now an Episcopal priest here in Richmond, but came right after me up here from Mississippi, told me earlier when I was asking him thoughts about this particular thing. He said the best small churches that I knew do one thing really well. And so I think one of the great challenges is trying to do a lot of things poorly when you already have limited resources.
Right.
And so, Katie, I actually, like 2 summers ago, wasn't very far from you over in the coastal Carolina Presbyterian, serving 2 churches in Harnum. In the long drive into town to pick up food was at a grocery store, was that there were more than one place along the way, if I needed to, at churches that had food pantries. And when you think about rural life, like people really do have to walk to the store. That's this, like people who live in cities think about walking to the store and how difficult it is. Well, that's happening out in the middle of nowhere with no sidewalks. And so that really, that sort of thing is so powerful, so outsized and influenced just by very virtue of knowing that it's there is a big deal. But I think it represents a congregation that does something like that and really, has its place there, that is a place of service, is an example of them doing one thing well. And I think that we can get tripped up trying to do too much.
Yeah, well
I want
said.
to make one more point, because I've been looking at this article just about ways, talking about size being a discouraging thing, which is that Philip Blackburn wrote an article for Presbyterian Outlook in April, and it talks about a small church in Arkansas that has 25 members. But that 25 members were in a 2,700 person town. And if we did that same thing in a 90,000 person city, what would that percentage, a 1% percentage of the church, would be considered a wild success. And I think that is also connected to the empire, because what we're really talking is not about what that percentage can contribute to the society. It's about what that percentage can contribute to the coffers. And what we'll also see, and this is great because in a lot of ways it holds up churches for a longer while, is that there can be certain small churches are thriving because one or two family members that are holding up these, financially holding up these spaces. And it's really important to keep in mind that those things aren't going to be there forever either.
Mhm.
And one more thing, and I didn't mention, the financial thing. If the church doesn't have an endowment, with the way the economy is going right now, it was amazing how good giving was during COVID. And now
Wow.
that we've been through, it's almost like people have gotten that they're here because the Lord got them through. And
Yeah,
so I think that's going to be a real challenge for a lot of churches with inflation. And, that's why we've taken the time to do a D-free program, which is about getting people out of debt, because a lot of people are in debt, and they're in debt. They can't support the church.
That's
It's got
wise.
to be.
That's really wise.
It's a real serious issue that's going to have to be looked at. I saw something. Carrie Newhoff had something on giving in 2024 and how few people are tithers. And even though I encourage people to tithe, I don't embarrass anybody. I don't make anybody lie by saying it all the time. But you try to encourage it as a lifestyle, but you got to help people get their houses in order, and a lot of financial illiteracy.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you for that. And Katie, anything you want to jump in with regard to this question? Thinking about the challenges that you're seeing with the small churches.
Yeah, I think that one of the biggest challenges, at least in our presbytery, but I think is the number of empty pulpits that we have. So we have 27 churches in our presbytery with no pastors, with no pastor. We have only one called and installed African American female pastor. And as I understand it from the Board of Pensions with the PCUSA, is that only about 20% of our African American churches in our denomination have pastors. So we have a huge demand for clergy, pastoral leadership, and a very low supply.
Right.
And that is one of the reasons I wanted to partner with Union to do this webinar, because I think it's a serious issue that we do not have a deep bench of pastors in which to pull from anymore. And that there was a real, I think, huge pipeline from, I'll speak Davidson to Union, and the pipeline from UNC Chapel Hill to Union. And those days are over. And so some of our small churches, I think, are not understanding that until they are in a transition, and calling the presbytery to say, hey, we need a pastor.
Right.
And I say, yes, you and a couple of dozen other churches. So I think the challenges are in those numbers and in those statistics. And I think that they really are calling for some solutions to how are we going to fill these pulpits in new and creative ways. And so that is, I think, one of the biggest challenges that our churches are facing, is pastoral leadership, and that there's a real vacuum. So I think some of the other questions you're going to ask us kind of get to maybe some of those solutions. But yeah, I think that from where I sit is one of the biggest challenges. We have one part-time staff person who's dedicated, her job solely is her dedication to filling empty pulpits and finding basically substitute preachers throughout our presbytery to go preach. And she keeps a whole spreadsheet and does her magic. But it is a real issue that our churches are facing.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I want to switch gears slightly, but it's building off of some of what we've talked about thus far. I want to draw our attention towards historic efforts of intercultural and class solidarity, and contrast that with the more contemporary, but also there's a storied history in this regard too of manipulative implementation of Christian nationalism that has targeted rural communities. So you have these two legacies that are very much in contrast with one another. I would love for you all to talk about strategies you have witnessed or used to combat Christian nationalism and to promote love across cultures. And if it feels right, particularly thinking about what the state of Mississippi has represented with regard to both of these legacies, but particularly thinking about some of my heroes, giants like Fannie Lou Hamer, giants like Medgar Evers, giants like David Dennis Sr., thinking about the work that they've done within the state of Mississippi. I'd love for David to start this answer off and then open it up to the whole panel as we will.
So you froze up there at the end. I have a feeling that question was for me. Are you there?
Oh, it is for sure.
Yeah. So I missed it. Yes. The history of Mississippi is a sordid one. I always like to remind everyone that that's true for all of us. That Mississippi is just kind of a reflection of the rest of the United States in so many ways. And that goes for the truly terrible things that have happened there, but also our greatest feats, like the saints and heroes that you just named. One thing that I think is an actual benefit to rural and small church ministry is that it's so much, actually, as difficult and frustrating as internal church politics can be, externally it is way easier to introduce one small group of people to another small group of people and forge bonds together. To be able to build community when everybody knows each other's name is absolutely it's easier, and it's we know this over and over. It's why there's social science behind what Jesus was saying about love your neighbor. Like, when you spend time with people, you relate to them, and when you relate to them, you want what's best for them, and when you want what's best for them, you serve them, you feed them, you share time and community with them. And so we have all over the Deep South this history of, there are a number of white churches that just down the road remain the Black churches that they helped create because of the enslaved people that they sat in the second floor. And what what they all have an opportunity to, and I've seen this happen in some really great churches, is to repair and create finally a shared communal relationship together, and to break bread together, and for these affluent churches to serve the broken history, and really turn it on its head, and really honor the fact that Christ broke through those terrible experiences, and I think that that's radical, and like not nearly as hard as people might think, and it really is best suited to start at the small church level and at the rural church level.
Yeah, thank you for that, David.
Well, like David said, in a lot of instances, you have the white church, and then across the road or down the road. And I've even seen instances side by side where both churches are there. And I think what we've got to realize that the theology that allowed slavery, allowed segregation, it's never been untaught. And so it's ingrained in a whole lot of people that way. In fact, I wrote that the churches started because they just didn't, slave owners didn't feel that the formerly enslaved were worthy to worship with them. So they just, said, look, we'll set up your church. There it is. I made an effort along with a younger white pastor in 2015. We did a countywide racial Bible study based on one of the Truett used to have this Christian ethics thing. It was a real good Bible study in that. But strangely enough, a lot of the pastors after the first session, they didn't even show up. And then 2 years ago, I tried to do a spiritual formation using Rick Fahoda's latest spiritual formation book, and nobody would participate. And it's real strange because there's a church down the road from me, and the pastor and I, we've had a good relationship, and that church was destroyed by a tornado. And when they did the first revival, he had me come and preach. During COVID, we got grant money to do an after-school program, and a lot of his members helped. So there is that it's a base where we can do it, but for so many, I go to association meetings, and it's just inbred in some of these pastors, and especially, they that don't want to further their education. I mean, they just feel like well, I'm gifted, so I'm going to preach. And it's real troubling that they do things the way they do, because I had one case in association meeting where a guy was supposed to make a report. He really didn't have to report. And he got up there and started talking about Colin Kaepernick kneeling. And a group of people got up and started cheering. And I went off. I mean, I said, the report has no relevance to mission. The mission that we're trying to do. So it's going to be hard. I don't know what it's going to take. Fortunately, I have a platform in that I write on a regular basis for the local newspaper, Pastor's Corner, and I deal with it. And the other thing, see, what you have to realize for a lot of Black Christians, they're totally naive or unaware of what this white nationalism is all about. And I have a book of the month every month, and most of them deal with this, and we talk about it. And I'm not ashamed to talk about it in my sermon because it's a real danger. I was in a physician's office today waiting on my wife, and this 90-year-old lady from Germany was in there. You wouldn't think she was 90 by the way she moved and the way she talked, but like she said, she sees so many things happening in the United States that she saw as a child. in Nazi Germany. And we have to be aware of that, and we can't let, as Howard Thurman says, we can't let a religion about Jesus be in the forefront, because they're in the forefront and it's hindering our mission trying to have the religion of Jesus that's concerned about the down and the left out, the marginalized, and those whose backs are against the wall.
Yeah, beautifully said. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Jump in.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to add that I really appreciated this question, Chris, and thinking about Christian nationalism and white supremacy in the rural church. I found in my preparation today some really helpful information from the Board of Pensions, which we usually see as very dry, but they recently I heard them quote that 75% of inquirers and candidates are not white men. Not white men. So for us to not talk about white supremacy or do anti-racism and cultural competency work with rural churches, I think is doing them a big disservice. Mm-hmm. If they are ever going to have a pastor, particularly the young one, or who straight out of seminary, they're most likely not going to be a white male. And so I think preparing our congregations to be led by someone who is not a white man is work that, particularly I think at the Presbyterian level, we could be doing, and getting folks to think who it is that God might be calling to their community to serve them. I also see our churches really pushing against Christian nationalism when they share worship space with immigrant communities. A lot of our small churches I have been very impressed and touched by their genuine hospitality in sharing space with immigrant communities. We have a church here in Raleigh that shares with a Ghanaian congregation. We have one in New Bern that shares with a group of folks from Myanmar. It's amazing, little things like that. And I also think one of the best ways that we can sort of push against this this wave of racism and white nationalism is to be the connectional church that, at least in the PCUSA, is an extremely important part of who we are. It's really baked into our DNA. We are not a congregationalist denomination. We really do believe that churches need to be connected to each other and that we're part of this bigger body. And I think if we can stay together, stay connected, not let our rural churches get isolated, and keep them in the fold, that is one way that we can help fight this hatred and racism we're seeing, that we can hold each other accountable and be in that community together. But I think we really have to live into our calling of being the connectional church, and hold on to that, because I think that's one of the gifts of at least the PCUSA that we have to sort of strive to make changes.
Thank you. Yeah, I think often are a good amount about how often Scripture, former English teacher, so disclaimer there. But I think about how many scriptures we read on a regular basis that have a rural setting. And I wonder how these passages sort of hit differently when you're talking about them within that context. And I want to ask you all, how have these passages affected the way that you minister? Leonard, let's start with you with this question. Oh, you're muted, my friend.
As I always say when I deal with a lot of texts, that it's a different economic economy. And that's the major thing in trying to get people to understand that. It's not that because it's agricultural that it changes the way I uh, preach, because I try to make it relevant, but I just want people to understand, that economy. Uh, like one of my favorites, Habakkuk 3:17 through 19, and when it talks about the figs and the sheep being in the thing, and trying to get people to relate that to the resources they have now. And but people, my wife reminds me of this all the time, and she grew up in the rural context, contrary to me. That people are the same today as they were in the Bible, and so I was I'm doing a Bible study for the next week, and I saw some terms in a common English Bible that I didn't understand, and I had to look them up. And
Yeah.
that's the real challenge when we talk about the agriculture in the Bible. Some of the terms we have no idea. This was, I think, from Job 6:9 or Job 6:14, and I said when something brands or something, and talking about it was a loud snort by one of the animals when God was responding back to Job. I want to say, I said, we have to be able to explain these things to help people appreciate the text.
Right.
But I really don't, when it comes to dealing with the agriculture, it's just, I don't see it as being as relevant. We have 10 acres of land just sitting there. And
Mhm.
as a pharmacist, I say in the Bible, in Genesis 1, it tells us that we should eat right. In Genesis 2, it tells us to exercise. And I've planted, we planted a garden one year, and I mean, the cucumbers and tomatoes were fine. But to get people to come back, and they will say, well, look, I grew up having to do that. I don't want to do it. Whereas Kate is a preacher in North Carolina. The people that Campbell told me about him, he said he was having all these funerals and whatnot, and he built a garden and at the church, and got the people to start eating the food that come out of the garden. And the lady said she went to the doctor after about 6 or 8 months, and he said, "What are you doing? What are you eating?" She said, "I'm eating what that preacher told me to eat." And he said, "Well, it's doing good for you." And so, I stress that we should have that. But like I said, it's just getting people to understand it. And then when they understand it, put it in a context of how we're living today. Because uh, I love the stories in the Old Testament. In fact, they call me the Old Testament preacher where I am. I stay in the prophets all the time. And really, if you read the prophets, it's real frightening right now if you look at our situation in the United States. But just to get people to appreciate what's going on. And when you say your 401k, that's somebody else's silver, or, your retirement is your flock and all of that stuff, so just getting that appreciation there.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Go ahead, David.
So to kind of yes and that, at the same time, there's this wonderful church down the road that I have the pleasure of doing pulpit supply sometime, called Concord Presbyterian. And whenever I go, I do often look at Old Testament texts, in part because there are some things they just understand a little bit better. And there are people who spend their whole life in cities who've never walked through a valley. And so how can you really understand the valley of the shadow of death if you've never actually been through a valley and recognize the vastness of those things? But the parable of the landowner who goes back into town over and over and over to hire laborers, that is a concept that Dr. Brian Blunt calls it's scandalous because of how ridiculous it is when when you imagine this person lives miles and miles away and multiple times goes into town to deal with it. And those are things that I think just like very naturally connects in a way that you can jump into it and place them in those places. And I think that there's a lesson. I think we're going to touch on this in a little bit, but I want to get it in there, which is that like there's a lesson to be had that I think our churches understand, which is like, thank God Jesus didn't give up on rural ministry,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, and like we get around to doing the rural ministry, it'll find its way to Rome.
Mm-hmm.
It'll get there, and Rome will understand what rural ministry means, and we know that because right now we're studying it. I didn't have to know. I didn't have to learn the word latifundalization from my esteemed Old Testament professors for me to know that that housing is a problem in the countryside too. That cost of housing is out of control, and that a lot of those factors are still going on, just like Dr. Edlow said. So I think that I really there are certain stories just that hit different,
Mm-hmm.
And I love being able to explore what that really looks like. I mean, being on the margins often means like being on the outside looking in at the frustrating things. Maybe the first half of Jonah, not so much the second, but and I think it gives you a sense of perspective that's really, really valuable.
Yeah, thank you for that, Dave, for sure. Okay, do you want to share anything to this point?
Yeah, I think when I visit congregations, I think I always try to remind them that even we worship this really big, cosmic, amazing, almighty God. I think about Paul's letter to the Ephesians that God can do abundantly far more than we can ask for
Right.
or imagine, which is really good news for a lot of our churches right now. And at the same time, this huge God can work with really small things and comes to us in small things. The infant in the manger in this little town of Bethlehem, the God of the mustard seed, God of a few loaves and fishes, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am there among them. So that's the good news that I try to remind them of, that this is a big God we worship, but God can take little things and do amazing things, do big things. And I think there's just really good news in that. And that scripture is over and over again shows us that God shows up in those small spaces, in those rural places. And I think helping to center those stories really helps. It's an act of pastoral care for churches that I think often feel like they're not centered and they're forgotten.
Yeah, thank you for that. I want to speak a bit about grief and ask you all, in what ways have you seen your community experience grief? And for the intensive purposes of this conversation, thinking about what strategies of resilience have you seen your communities demonstrate in the midst of grief? So I want to let's get David to chime in on this, and then we'll share it around.
Sure. Thank you. So we've tiptoed around this, tap danced around this is our congregations are literally dying. And since we've talked about how much of an impact 25 people really can be in a small place, losing 3 of them in 1 year is devastating. And a church can really just spiral when those sorts of things happen. and they will. And and so I think one thing that we are suited for as Christians is recognizing that death is not the final word. And so we should be thinking about what resurrection looks like as as we're in this, this kind of apocalypse moment. And because of that, um, I think facing it, I think talking about it, and having healthy ways to talk about it is really, really important. And one church that I know of that's small, not rural, but in Glen Allen, is led by a solo pastor, Ann Cherry, who works with they have a they lease space, their parlor space, to a therapist who they contract with for weekly sessions that group sessions where members of the church can come and talk about books, talk about life. They're supposed to be following a reading each week, and sometimes they do, but what they really do is process with one another. And they spend time with one another, and they work through the troubles of the world, and the troubles of their small church. I think it's one of the most beautiful experiences I've ever gotten to take part of, is people being open and sharing. And when they go through a lot all at once, if a church has been communicating with one another, what they will find is strength when the time to grieve comes. They will find grief as something to welcome, because it represents that there's something coming, um, all things new. And it's miserable to be in this moment, but what a time to be talking about it, if not Advent, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think a lot of small churches, a lot of rural churches, and probably more bigger churches than want to admit, are in an Advent moment.
Yeah, well said. Thank you for that, David. Katie and Leonard.
It's tough. It's real tough. Now, I had one instance. This lady, she knew she was terminal, and I'm feeling sorry. And I was at Hampton at the ministers' conference, and I was sitting in my car, and she called me. And the strength and the courage that she displayed just talking to me on the phone. When she died, I was able to transfer that. And it just made that one real. It made it a lot easier for the family and the church. Now, during COVID, I had a young lady who died from COVID. It was amazing. She had a testimony that she put on Facebook the day before, and actually she stood up and had an embolism and died. And she was one of my go-to people. She comes from a large family. And the family has held together. But it's still difficult. And we do all we can, but it's a void that's gonna never be filled, because she's with that group that was the next leadership group in the church, and she was the point person. And then I have another instance where one person lost 3 family members, and regardless of what we tried to do, it's just been hard dealing with it. I'm not trained. My wife is a lot better trained. She knows how to talk to people and handle things like this. I have resources in Logos for counseling. But, I realized, like, when I took pastoral studies, they said, you can only go so far. And so I don't go nowhere near the end, because I like to stay in my lane. But it's something real hard for a church, and it's going to be different in every situation. And some, when when a person has a strong testimony before they die, it's much easier. But when something is sudden or when something is repetitive, uh, it's real hard to deal with that. And I know I'm not answering your question, but all I can do is support, pray for, uh, and be there. And
Mhm.
that's something I always pride myself. If someone call and say, "We want you to be here," uh, I mean, I have closed up the pharmacy or paid somebody to drive an hour and a half just to be there when that person transitioned if they call me
Yeah.
to. So uh, it's difficult.
It's funny you say you didn't think you were answering the question, but what I heard in that was the critical strategy of ministry of presence. Just a sense of being there and really disabusing yourself from that whole sense of like having to have an answer. Sometimes it's being willing to sit in that sort of liminal space of not knowing what the answer is that is actual ministry. So thank you for that. Katie, anything you'd like to add to this?
Yeah, I think related to presence, I think one of the ways I see our churches being resilient is they show up for each other and for their churches, even in the midst of that grief. There's, when you have a small church and one person dies, it's a big deal, and it literally takes out a percentage of the congregation, to say nothing of the spiritual and emotional grief that folks are feeling. Um, we've had a small church here in our presbytery that lost a beloved stated supply pastor. Their clerk of session then died on the operating table a few weeks later. But my gosh, that church has showed up to presbytery gathering. They have their session meetings. They show up at the tomb ready to anoint the body, and they're doing the work of the church. And I've just been really touched by the discipleship and the commitment and the faithfulness of some of these small churches to continue to do church and be church, even in their grief, and to really show up for each other. It's been pretty remarkable, and I think that they are. Every time a member dies, it really raises a lot of questions, like what does our future hold, and what adjustments do we need to make? Is now the time to have the conversation about closing the church, or is now the time to have the conversation about repurposing our building? So they're asking big questions in the midst of that grief, and I think really we be present to each other. We show up for those churches that are asking those questions and in those grief spaces, and we let them know that they're not alone, that they're part of that connectional body, and that we can be the body of Christ to them and to each other as they walk through that grief.
I want to pivot to some of our audience questions. So thank you to those of you who sent in your questions or shared your questions. It was a really great question that I want to have David start our conversation. It says, what factors need to come together to help seminary students get experience working in small church and rural contexts? So, David, you're in this right now. For those of you who are in the audience, it's finals week and the end of the semester here at the seminary. So David is an extraordinary trooper right now. Go ahead, David.
Hey, look, this is a nice break before I return to the books. But yeah, Katie, I don't know if you saw me just bouncing my head when you were talking about filling pulpits. The first thing we got to do is get people to come to seminary. So like we got to talk. I mean, we're talking about putting people in pulpits. Like we got to put people in the seats in seminary. And so I got these great shoes. I love these shoes so much, and they're Cole Haans. I don't know if you like Cole Haan. I love them. They I can wear them when I'm running around. I can wear them when I'm walking around the house. I can do whatever I need to. They are great and you should buy them. How different is that than me asking you, why don't you have these shoes? What's your problem? Why don't you have these shoes? I think that is one of those things that a reframing that really needs to happen across the board in church. Why aren't people coming to church? Hey, you should come. It's really fun to come to church. Like those are two things that are saying the exact same thing. Um, and I think the Presbyterian Church needs to be telling people that there's a future for them if they go to seminary. And it is in a lot of ways a chicken and egg situation. Um, you have a shepherd, they're going to find sheep, and sheep are going to try to find the shepherd. And so that's the first thing. Seminary, I hope any seminary potential seminarians are listening. It is a fun place to be. It is a great community. It is difficult. It is challenging. It is highly academic, and the community is incredible. The people that you get to spend time with are incredible. The people you get to learn from are incredible. Nobody ever told me that. Like nobody. Yeah, I said in the thing in my intro that I wanted to that I considered law school. I didn't really want to. If somebody had told me how fun seminary was, and what the joy of learning would be, I would have been there earlier, and hopefully I would have been serving a church by now. But more than that, I'd be dragging people into it. And so the first thing is, like, if you're watching right now, if you know a 16, 17-year-old who's about to go to college, if they just have a glimmer of that potential for ministry, put it in their head. All they can do is throw it away, but they won't. I mean, that's not how the Spirit works. And they just need to think about it I wish I had thought about it that way when I was finally spiritually prepared to think about seminary. I wish most of us had that as an option to consider in the first place. And it never crosses our minds because there are so many other ways that we think we can do ministry in the world. But we really should also be thinking about this one. I'm sorry, I'm very passionate. I hope I'm not like talking in circles here. But the first step is getting us here. The second step is telling them how much fun it is to be in churches, telling them how much fun it is to be in pulpits, telling them how much fun it is to go to rural communities, that how much better the food is, how much bigger the parsonage is. Like these are there are real wonderful benefits to me. How much the space, the hiking. Oh my gosh. I served Raven Rock Presbyterian Church in North Carolina, and it was 2 miles from one of the most beautiful state parks on the East Coast. Those are things that real joys that come from living in spaces like that. And we spend so much time talking about the challenges because we don't want anybody to go in with blinders on, but we got to make sure they know that it's also wonderful.
Mm-hmm. Now, David, I don't know if the Presbyterian Church has a board of tourism, but if they do, you need to be nominated for that board. That was extraordinary. Don't ever apologize for passion. It's a beautiful thing. Katie or Leonard, you care to chime in with this as you think about it, both serving in the church and serving in the Presbytery? What other factors do we need? David says we got to get folks to seminary first before we even talk about getting to the church or the rural context. But what else do we need? Part of that question I didn't read is it's saying, which I felt was kind of a rhetorical question, do we need some kind of endowment to finance it? I feel that the answer is like, of course, but that's easier said than done, obviously. But chime in both on that Presbyterian and on that church level, Katie and Leonard.
Well, as far as, once they get to seminary, now, when I was in seminary, I had to serve as an intern. So that was part of my education. And what we need to do is define, identify people in these rural areas And what I've been pushing for is restarting. In the 1950s, they had Dr. Ellison started at Virginia Union, and it was Dr. Harry Richardson's idea to have these departments of rural ministry in the church. And now she shared it with me. I don't know if she shared it with anybody else. Dr. Katie Cannon told me, she said, well, I really feel like the rural ministry ought to be part of the women's center. So there needs to be, we need to seriously look at rural ministry. Rural ministry has supplied the members of the urban church. It's been a great training ground for a lot of pastors of your urban churches. When you listen to these guys and they tell you where they've been, some of them been at 2-3 churches in the country before they make it to the city. And so the investment has to be made and be real. It can be real rewarding. I mean, I enjoy serving the people where I am now. I mean, I look forward to Sunday morning. I look forward to. I work real hard at preparing. I miss a whole lot of things because I say I'm not going to give my people dog food, and they really appreciate when they get a real meal on Sunday morning. But people got to see that. And so if it's just like if somebody was is at Union and wants to intern under me, and it doesn't mean they have to spend a lot of time there because you still got your regular thing to do. But it would be preaching opportunities, it would be teaching opportunities, it'd be able to come to meetings and whatnot, see what's going on, and it would prepare them because in many instances that's where they got to go first. That's where they got to go first. And
Yeah.
we gotta look at, we gotta get rid of this patriarchy and get more women involved. I mean, it's you look out in the congregation, you got all these women, and I'm glad to say I've got 7 deacons and only 2 of them are men. The rest of them are women, because I just believe in. They call me a womanist, but whatever that means.
Just to circle back on the truth is that our smaller churches can't pay the interns, and the bigger churches can. The seminary is not huge anymore. 3 churches can have all the interns.
But I was an intern at a mega church and I didn't get 50 cents.
Well, they are required for our supervised ministry to pay. And there are ways to apply for small grants, but the best these small churches are going to get is 3 months of supervised ministry, but they're not going to be able to get year-round interns the way that the other ones are, and so are the students that are getting pulpit experience or getting not just pulpit experience but congregational ministry experience. A lot of times we got bills to pay, and it's hard work to write a sermon. And so it's not nearly as easy to serve the smaller churches. It really.
I want to use pharmacy education as an example. The final year is done with rotations. And you go on rotations, you pay your regular tuition, and you don't get paid a cent, and you actually work in pharmacy or hospital for a whole year. And so that's why I didn't have any problem when I was told I had to do an internship, and I didn't get paid for it because I had students come to me all the time, and they weren't getting paid, but they were working. Right. So it's something, we got to, sure, if a student came and they preached one Sunday, I would make sure a check would be written. I mean, to me, that's an insult when you have somebody preach and you don't pay them, even though it's happened to me before. but it's, we just got to look at ways to do it to make it work. Because if you don't get the student in the rural setting and they don't get the expertise, and then when they go out, it's 50-50 whether it's going to work or not work. And after all that education, the worst thing to happen is to lose somebody with training because of bad experience in a rural context, because some of them can be very challenging. I was in one for 13 years, and so if it wasn't for my faith in God, I wouldn't be in ministry.
Mhm.
And the people in the church that loved me versus the empire that I was fighting in the church.
Come on. That's true.
I wonder too how the seminaries and presbyteries and other mid-council bodies might partner together to get those students in the small churches.
Mhm.
I can imagine a scenario in which the field ed placement is at the presbytery office, and then those students are going out into a variety of small churches throughout a summer or a school year, and they're being mentored and coached by presbytery staff, by other pastors in the um, presbytery. So I think that the mid-council level could be a help to that funding piece as they partner with the seminaries to help make those connections and get those students in the door. But I agree with David's point that we've got to start way down the pipeline. And if you know a high schooler, nurture them and encourage and get them to think about seminary. I think many of the clergy who are serving right now, who are probably in their 30s or 40s, we are some of like the last generation that we were going to church regularly on Sunday mornings and going to youth group. And as our churches have shrunk, so have the youth groups. The Montreat Youth Conferences, which I used to staff when I was in high school in the 2000s, had 6,000 young people in a summer. They're now excited if they get 5,000. So that the number of churches going to say a Montreat Youth Conference has not really changed, but the size of those youth groups have shrunk considerably. So we've got to get to our younger people so that we can get them seats at the seminaries and get them into the churches. But it's all part of one connectional system that I see, and getting that field ed experience goes alongside presenting seminary in an exciting light to young people who might be considering it or might not be, but are looking to be of service.
So
I think the
keep
last
jumping
thing
in
I'd
on
say
this
too is I
because of
think
my enthusiasm. Thank you to
the
all those things.
bivocational piece is
Katie,
really important. Yeah, just being bivocational seems to be an increasing trend among our pastors, and as they work in a nonprofit field while pastoring a church, that seems to be something that we need our churches to be open to, is a pastor that maybe isn't going to be full-time, but is part-time, and they're going to be receiving additional income and a livelihood through another vocation that complements their work as a pastor.
I'm sorry about that. You froze up, so I didn't know you weren't finished.
That's okay.
I thank you for saying all those things, and just I want to specifically name the wacky idea that the Presbyterian of Coastal Carolina did for me in the previous summer, which was bonkers and brilliant. But it required buy-in from the churches. But we've got these empty manses that are out there that still have access to the internet, and there are still pastors in the general area who are ready to help and guide. And basically, I had these two pastors who I met up with every week and talked through my week. And then on Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, I was in the church alone. And I could always call on people, but the churches themselves are self-sustaining in their own ways. So I was the first time in years that they had somebody filling their pulpit every week all summer long. And they were so gracious and willing to let me make mistakes, because we were both there for each other in community. And I think we need to open that up and create. I think we need to be a little bit brave, and Presbytery should be brave like Coastal Carolina to bring this to churches and saying, if you've got an empty manse and you want somebody to be a resident for a summer, this is a way for you to have an intern and create space for them. And it was life changing for me. And I think it was meaningful to them. We wondered if I was going to have a full experience because we were in rural churches. I ended up preaching a funeral. I ended up having to participate in a funeral. I mean, we had the whole breadth of experiences that summer because life happens in those places. And so we do need to be creative, but we also need to take chances. If there are people who are champing at the bit to get out there into the world, we need to not create roadblocks. Our presbyteries have the opportunity to do really cool things, be encouraging instead of telling people they need to be afraid about what they're going to see.
That's wonderfully said. I want to ask you this as a final question. Frankly, what are your hopes for rural and small churches? We'd like to start us off with that. What are your hopes?
I'll start. I think one of my biggest hopes for our small churches is that they would lean into each other, and that they would find ways to share resources, and to be the connectional church, and to find ways to share pastors, to share curriculum, to share services. That the way forward is really going to be going and doing it together. And to know that small churches are not doing anything wrong. There's no magic bullet. There's nothing that if they just did this or just did that things would get turned around. They're part of a bigger system that's bigger than any of us, and a mass exodus of folks to urban centers. And so I think our small churches have to consider what it is to go and do ministry together, when there is scarcity, that we can find abundance in each other, and to continue to be the connectional church that way.
Thank you for that, Katie. Leonard or David?
Yeah, well, I'd like to see a change in theology. Too much personal piety in the Black church, that suffer and endure, and we're going to get this reward in heaven. I like to see a whole lot more social Christianity and real involvement in the community. And so many times we talk about what we don't have, but there are foundations, especially where I am, that have a lot of money and are willing to invest in programs with churches. I especially the Black church, get rid of patriarchy, embrace women in ministry. I see too much of that. I've been to church services where a husband and a wife were deacons, and the wife couldn't come in the pulpit, the male could, and it's still there. And then I'd like to see it's how I want to say it. I'd like to see better trained ministers, because so you talk about getting people in the seminary. There's a whole lot of pseudo seminaries out there, that are taking people who could really, if work with, do great things. So I'm looking for, and when I talk about theology, it's a whole lot of things. It's a thing against people having fun. I'm saying, one of our values is nothing is more fun, than laughing with people that you love. And sometimes, we go into church and we got to be so serious about everything. And I've always believed in a holistic ministry, dealing with the entire person. And that's how I've been able to bring together practicing pharmacy and being a pastor, because it's so much. And just bring that holistic approach. And like I said, this is the way I preach. I don't wear a robe. Very seldom I wear a suit. If you check out the YouTube channel, I might have a suit on when we do communion. I haven't had a robe on. I'll put on a robe for a wedding and a funeral. That's not being a joke about trying to say wear this a funeral also. But I just want people to be free and come as you are. We have too many limitations on people, and people got this feeling they got to be this way, they got to be that way. And even when it gets to the lifestyle thing, I just want to share the empowering gospel of Jesus with you. I'm not going to judge you. And see, I was judged early in my ministry for dedicating children or parents who weren't married. But the thing about it, when I started dedicating those children, those women came into the church and they became strong. And see, so as long as the church is negating people, and a lot of that is learned behavior too, just like the white supremacy, is a lot of things that these traditions of men that we've got to get rid of that have no biblical basis and are just holding back not only the ministry, but having people be all that God wants them.
Thank you.
My hope is that soon, hopefully, that we as a collective Christian body look to rural churches for solutions as well, not just for the problems, but the ways that they succeed. What are they doing right? What are our suburban churches failing at that our country churches are succeeding with? I think a lot of times what you'll find is what Katie was talking about community, about rural churches don't have the luxury to treat themselves like cell phone companies where you can only belong to one. And so there are lessons already there. I don't think the rural church is going away. And so I hope that we can make sure that we're also learning from them.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Thank you. And I want to say thank you once again to all of our guests, Reverend Katie Cashwell, Reverend Dr. Leonard Edlow, Mr. David McDowell. Thank you all so much for this enlightening, joyful, and hopeful, and really asset-based conversation. Not something that just focused on, as David put it, what's wrong, but what are the things that are being done right that ought to be replicated in suburban and urban context. So thank you for that. I want to encourage you all who are watching and listening, if you aren't currently subscribed to our Substack, to please subscribe to our Substack, leadershipinstitute.substack.com. That's where you'll find out not just about our monthly webinars, but about all of the offerings that we have here at the Leadership Institute. Things like interim training that just ended last month, something that helps a lot of as you heard Reverend Cashwell speak about the empty pulpits. A lot of those pulpits are filled by those who are serving as interim ministers and pastors. You'll also be able to hear about our Pathways course that helps train another group of folks who help meet this need. That's our commissioned ruling elders, CREs. You're seeing Katie give the applause for that, as we all should be applauding the wonderful work that they're doing as CRE folks. But definitely want to draw your attention to something that Leonard mentioned when he spoke about womanism. That's something they say, well, what is that? I've never heard that word before. I want to encourage you, in January, we're going to have another one of our courses in that Womanist Leadership Institute course line is going to be available in January, so you'll definitely want to sign up for that. We'll also have a few book clubs coming up and more announcements. A lot of wonderful things going on here at the Leadership Institute, so you definitely want to stay tuned in, and you can do that by subscribing at leadershipinstitute.substack.com. Once again, thank you so much to all of our guests. Thank you to you all for watching and asking such wonderful questions. The comments were on fire. It was beautiful to see just lighting up as we were conversing. And until next time, God bless you and keep you. Be well and take care. Thank you all so much.